Got off the bus and it was in the morning, like 1 o'clock. You had to stand, there was like a yellow line, like down the middle of the highway. You had to stand with your toes on the middle line. I was still, like I am now, in civilian clothes with my duffel bag, and it had started to rain. Well, everybody that had kept their mouth shut got dismissed. These guys that thought they were left behind, they were standing in the rain, and we were going inside. So there's your first acquaintance with things. You kind of get a feeling about what's going on. You know, let's do a lot of listening and paying attention here rather than making suggestions.
In the Air Force, Gary DeMay's first line was not a radio frequency. It was yellow paint on wet pavement. From Veterans Voices of Newton, this is Listening on the Line. Gary's lesson in listening began at Lackland, but the habit of showing up for other people began much earlier.
I grew up in upstate New York, near Rochester, New York, in the suburbs, town, Newark, New York. Went through school in Newark, Newark High, and graduated. I worked most of the time ever since I was 12 years old with a paper route, or then I got a job in a hardware store. I think one of the big things is that my family at large, and I call that both sides, mom's side and dad's side, uncles and all that sort of stuff, we were like a big family unit. It really was, you know. We helped out each other, and that happened early on in my life, where one of the uncles would have some project and he needed help, and Dad would go, and I would go with him. My grandfather had a farm where he had dairy cows, and one of the uncles was working with him, and I would go there to stay over with Grandma and Grandpa, and so I learned about that. I learned, you know, how to drive a tractor and all that good kind of stuff.
This was before your military service?
That's before my military service. After I graduated, I was accepted at what they call NYSUT, New York State University. I went to Brockport State College for teaching, and started that development. I wasn't really hooked on thinking about that I wanted to be a teacher, so after 2 years I said, this really I don't think is for me. So anyway, it was in January of '63, and so I stopped going to school.
It was the January of 1963. Leaving college made Gary newly eligible for the draft, as America's involvement in Vietnam was expanding.
So I stopped going to school. I told my dad, and my dad said, well, now you're eligible for the draft. I didn't understand that too much, what it was all about. But he said, you have the choices. He said, you know, that you can just get a job and maybe they won't call you, because it was like a lottery kind of thing. Or he said, you know, you could choose a branch to go in. I said, after talking to my other uncles, one had been in the Army and one had been in the Marines, and knowing my father had been in what became the Air Force, he was in the Army Air Corps during World War II, I said, well, maybe I can get into the Air Force and seek some career development there. And so I did. I signed up, and well, I took my chance by saying, well, I'm going to go in for 4 years, and all my uncles did, and my dad did. I said, I'll do my piece, you know. And like I say, maybe I will get something from it. Now, I already had a girlfriend, and we were kind of serious. So on Valentine's Day off, I went to Syracuse to be inducted into the Air Force.
Gary asked to work in administration. The Air Force had another idea.
Proceeded and so forth. And he said, I'm sorry, but where you have said that you want to go, we don't really need anybody in that area right now. We need people in air traffic control is one of the areas. And so that's where I got assigned to. I didn't really have much choice there. And so that was that. So off I went to Keesler, Mississippi, spent a few months there receiving training. One of the unique things that was done at that time, and I don't even know if they do that anymore, was Morse code training. Just like you're wearing your phones, you put your phones on, and you had to be fast enough, so you were doing, I think it was 42 words per minute. You had to be able to write them down. Actually, after that, when I actually got out in the field in my first job assignment, we never used Morse code after that. But that was one thing we did. I think one of the things that helped me a little bit was the fact that I had taken typing in high school. I had taken typing and I did very, very well at that. And so that made it a little easier with the code, because I had the feeling for the keys. So all I had to really do was listen and I could hit the appropriate key.
Listening had become Gary's job. Catch the signal, put it into words, and pass it down the line.
So then after Keesler, that was in Mississippi, I got my first duty assignment. It was stateside and was Washington, D.C. So I went to Andrews Air Force in D.C. in the 2045th Comm Squad and spent my time there. And you sit behind a console, and the console already has on it so you can pick up frequencies for the aircraft. Okay, so we were only communicating with Air Force aircraft, not any other branch of the service, and only those within the area that was designated in the DC area. And they would give us reports that we would type out, and there'd be a guy behind us, another airman behind us, and he'd take it and he'd give it to the teletype guy. They would send it off where it had to go. I was able to have my wife with me. It was a nice base, and it was close to other bases, so we could get to use the what we called the BX, which is a grocery store. There was GI housing available, which I stayed into for a while, and it was available. So I got that home in Maryland, and Beltway was there, so it was like civilian duty to me, really. You got up in the morning, got in your car, and you went to work, and when your shift was over, you were back home. So it was really quite a bit for me like civilian duty.
Then the war began moving closer, not through gunfire, but through an assignment list.
Assignments start coming down, and again, a tech sergeant that I had got to know, a real fine gentleman, he took me aside and he said, many of these assignments that are coming in now, the guys are going off to Vietnam. He said, you've just had a baby. He said, there's open assignments. So he listed off Thule, Greenland, and the other one was up in Alaska, and then the one in the Azores. And the one in the Azores was considered to be semi-remote. Because I was not an NCO at the time, I could not bring my wife when I went there. I think it was only like for 8 months, not even a full year that I spent there. And basically did the same thing that I did in DC, that type of thing. It was smaller. Most of the time, because of where we were, the aircraft that were flying Air Force type were the Phantom jets, and they would fly over, but they would be refueled in midair. They wouldn't come down and land at the base unless there was mechanical difficulties with the aircraft. You had to keep them separated at the right altitude, and keep them communicating. And we would get reports from B-52s because they're 24 hours a day at that time. They were flying, and they would send us coded messages, but that was not done by us. We, again, passed it back to teletype, and they took care of it. So that was interesting because when we first got there, again, we were set and we were given information as far as this country, this base, although it is an island, is a part of Portugal, and Portugal is run by a dictator, and you have to be very careful. The bus would come from the town, would come on the base to pick up people. We could go back in the bus and you could tour the town, or you can even go to restaurants, which I did with a friend at one time. And that was very, very interesting because they said, when you're on the bus and you're talking to your friends and so forth, do not talk politics. Do not talk about their politics or any of that sort of stuff, because if somebody is on the bus and says something to somebody, he said, they'll arrest everybody on the bus. He said, not just you.
Once again, there were lines Gary understood he should not cross. His service was not the combat story many listeners might expect from the Vietnam era. It was technical, disciplined, and often routine. But routine does not mean insignificant. Militaries depend on people who listen accurately, communicate clearly, and remain at their stations when almost no one outside the system knows their names.
I said, well, I want to give my 4 years and be done, so that's basically what I did. And when I got out, I was a sergeant.
Gary never described his service as an ordeal. He called it very, very civil. But when he returned home, he was not the same student who had left. Gary had chosen 4 years, When those 4 years ended, he left the Air Force as a sergeant and returned to the path he had walked away from. He went back to college, completed his degree, and became an elementary school teacher, eventually developing a particular interest in science. The young man who had decided teaching wasn't for him came home ready to become a teacher after all.
You grow up and you learn some things, more things than you would learn. I would think that if I had not, maybe I'd went back at the hardware store, or maybe at some day I would have became manager or something like that, But it is what it is, When I got out of the service, of course, I went back and I finished my degree and became an elementary school teacher. And I did not do a lot with history other than what was according to the curriculum, because my development was in the science area. So I took a lot of electives in the science area.
The Air Force had not given Gary the career field he requested. It had given him something harder to measure: distance from the person he had been, and enough experience to choose who he wanted to become next. Listening was not simply an order from a training instructor or a skill performed through headphones. It had become a way of moving through uncertainty. Observe first, learn what the moment requires, and then decide how to respond. Gary had encountered Washington once before the Air Force. At 17, during a high school trip to the Capitol, he saw the vice president walking through the hallway.
When I was in high school at 17, we went to Washington, D.C. at that time, and we did visit the Capitol building. And I think it was Vice President Nixon, he was vice president at the time, came down the hall. The principal of our school happened to be the leader of our group that I was with. He stopped and talked to them, and then he spoke to us as well. I got to shake his hand, and, so okay, hey, that was that.
Gary had shaken hands with history once before. But the handshake that mattered more in Gary's life was the kind his father had taught him about. Not ceremonial, but binding.
I learned from my dad early on about making a deal and shaking hands. And today, that's hardly done anymore. I watched that, and I became that way too. If we make a deal and we shake hands, I don't need a piece of paper. That's it. If I said to you, I'm going to do it, you better believe I'm going to be there and I'm going to do it.
Listening taught Gary when not to speak. The handshake taught him that once he did speak, his words had to mean something. One value was restraint, the other was follow-through. Together, they formed a quiet code: pay attention, say what you mean, and be there when you said you would.
I came to the post. I live in Needham.
Decades later, Gary found his way into another community built on showing up for one another. And he found it almost by accident.
I came to the post because in one of the rooms that they rent out, they were having various geology clubs and organizations. I came because I'm a fossil collector, and I was a card-carrying Legion member at the time. I was carrying the card. I had it for about 3 years. But that's it. I just had them all. I didn't go to meetings and all that sort of stuff where I was just carrying the cards. So I come downstairs, and when I come downstairs, I stood in the doorway and I was just looking around and so forth. And there was 4 guys standing there, and one was Nick Pascarosa, who was the commander of the SAL at the Sons of the American Legion at the time. He stepped out and he came over to me and he says, "Hi, haven't seen you here." I said, "Well, I haven't been here before." So then we got talking, and they were there because they were going to have a meeting in this room that we're in right now. And he said, "Want to come in and sit down for the meeting?" "Why not?" I said, "I've got the time. I'll come in and sit down." So when we got all done, again, he came around to me and he says to me, "So what do you think?" I says, "I think I want to join." And that was that.
A man who had carried the card for 3 years became part of the community because somebody noticed him standing in a doorway and invited him inside. It was not so different from the extended family of Gary's childhood, or from the bonds he remembered in the Air Force.
One of the biggest things I think that happened is, more so than anything else, probably the camaraderie between people, the camaraderie that you developed. And that is rolled over here as far as the American Legion is concerned too. We help each other, and we want to help the community as far as Newton is concerned, in the way of the veterans and so forth, and providing veterans in all areas anything that we can do in that area.
At Post 440, that camaraderie became local again. Veterans helping one another, serving the community, and making room for younger people who wanted to listen. That invitation, from a doorway into a meeting, became another line in Gary's life, connecting one community to the next.
Of course, now I can because of my age, being 84 next month. I've got a lot behind me, but I still have a lot in front of me. Yeah.
I do think it's important for kids, because something I think kids don't know is a lot of kids just kind of, I've met kids who glorify military service, I've met kids who just vehemently despise it, but I feel like a lot of people just view like soldiers or veterans completely differently from like the civilian. But I feel like that line can be more thin than people think. Gary's life crossed that line and crossed back. A paper boy, a farm kid, a college student unsure of his direction, an airman listening across military frequencies, a husband and father separated from home, a teacher, a fossil collector, a Legion member. The uniform mattered, but it never erased the person underneath it. Gary's story does not turn on one battle or one dramatic act. It turns on smaller decisions, whether to wait for the draft or choose a branch, whether to resist an unexpected assignment or learn from it, whether to remain outside a meeting or accept an invitation inside. And once he gave his word, he would show up.
Life brings you all kinds of experiences, and I guess you choose how to react to them. And I choose to react to them in a way of as a learning experience and then making a decision positively for it, or this is something that I really don't want to participate in, that type of stuff. But I appreciate the opportunity to share this with you, and I'm wishing that you, as a young man, have as good a future as I've had.
Gary DeMay served 4 years in the United States Air Force, working in military communications and air traffic operations at Andrews Air Force Base and in the Azores. He later completed his education, became an elementary school teacher, and found renewed camaraderie through American Legion Post 440. Thank you for listening to this episode of Veterans Voices. If you know a veteran in the Newton or Boston area whose story deserves to be preserved, please reach out. I'm Ethan Lee, a Newton North High School student preserving the stories of veterans in my community. And to Mr. Gary DeMay, thank you for your service, for the wisdom you've carried forward, and for giving me the chance to listen. To hear more stories from veterans in our community, please visit veteransvoicesofnewton.org.